Hi, welcome to our channel Good News. TCurrently, nations all around the world are vying to advance in the fifth generation of communication technology. Many nations seek to utilize 5G to seize control of the upcoming communication technologies. China's Huawei seized the lead in this industry, and its perseverance has now paid off. It is now at the apex of 5G development. The United States, a hegemonic nation that has consistently maintained its dominance in the field of cutting-edge technology, has started to impose restrictions on Huawei's growth. The US has decommissioned Huawei's 5G infrastructure and supported the new Open RAN network technology. However, this is improper conduct. The development of Huawei's 5G is still booming. The Open RAN, the first batch of equipment that included the 5G base station that the United States had been promoting, has already been turned off, and it is anticipated that the remaining ones may follow soon. The United States has seen Huawei advance 5G technology faster than its own countrymen. The US has its sights set on the entire planet and is prepared to fight with China for this 5G market, even going so far as to disparage Huawei. Can the US thus expand the 5G business to Africa? Will this have an impact on Huawei? The US traveled to Africa to discredit Huawei in order to create 5G. Is Huawei treated fairly? Deputy Secretary of State Sherman recently traveled to 3. South Africa, Angola, and Gabon are all African nations. Specifically, the US Deputy Secretary of State visited Africa. Not for touring, not even for a visit. In this year's May 5th, Sherman tweeted the following day after visiting the Africell, a telecom firm owned by the United States. Today in Luanda, I visited Africell Angola, a reputable American business with a reputation for innovation that is using tried-and-true technology to extend 5G channels in Angola. Sherman was questioned about if the tweet implied that Western businesses in the US may provide 5G services to African nations in order to break them free from Chinese telecom corporations during the press conference the next day. Sherman clarified that this is not an allegation against Huawei, but then started to disparage the company, saying, "We have been very directly believed that when countries choose Huawei, they give up their national sovereignty and hand over data to another country, and they'll find themselves unknowingly being watched." Additionally, the United States dominates the 5G Open RAN standard. The US has long since stopped communicating. Makers of equipment, however, the US does not, would want to observe a reduction in mobile communication. As a result, the 5G Open RAN was created. On the one hand, it helps the company maintain its dominant position in the market for server chips. However, it closes the market's gap for communication equipment. This can be considered to be achieved with a single motion. According to the US, Open RAN may foster a more competitive environment, enabling operators to roll out services more rapidly and lower 5G network implementation and maintenance costs. However, although the ideal is lovely, the truth is harsh. However, for some reason, the United States blatantly disallowed Huawei and even demanded that European carriers give up Huawei's equipment, which has complicated the development of 5G networks for European operators. Following a significant slowdown in the rollout of 5G networks and the disassembly cost coming in at $1.5 billion higher than anticipated, British operators have said they would postpone efforts to remove Huawei equipment. US operators took the lead in commercializing the Open RAN standard under pressure. The goal was to show Open RAN to international operators. US operators now claim that Open RAN's maintenance costs are too costly. Since the Open RAN standard has suffered a serious blow, European operators will be less eager to remove Huawei's hardware. For the United States to compete with China for the African market at first was virtually nothing. Since there is now economic globalization, there will be more intense rivalry, and you will come and go. But throughout this process, the United States has persisted in promoting itself, which is nothing, and even going so far as to disparage its rivals. Such a strategy is not particularly effective. It is quite possible that the US intends to expand the US 5G market in Africa now that it is defaming Huawei in this manner and elevating itself in this manner. So, can the United States actually achieve that? Will the American plot be successful? In actuality, it could be challenging to implement the US action. First, Huawei's 5G is essentially getting worldwide adoption. Worldwide recognition, progressing steadily in the direction of a global breakthrough. This is not without merit. Between March 4th and Huawei and Verizon struck a 5G partnership on March 5th of this year. Brazil and Turkey, in that order. Brazil even collaborated. Huawei implemented 5G technologies and built smart factories. Makes it possible to estimate Huawei's influence in the 5G industry. Growing, which the United States is probably not doing. States can discredit. US 5G in Africa is based on the idea that I worry that Huawei 5G will be challenging to use. Second, although being in general somewhat backward, the African continent is not a remote mountain and forest. OpenSignal, a British data crowdsourcing firm, published a fresh study on February 16 of this year. The survey claims that as 5G technology gained popularity at the tail end of 2019, the speed of international data connections has increased. The 5G network in the USA has improved, though. The growth rate is the most recent number. In fact, it's unknown if the African market would acknowledge and adopt 5G in the United States. Therefore, some believe that this action by the United States may be intended to directly enjoy the benefits of Huawei's prior efforts and to gather the fruits of the trees Huawei worked so diligently to grow in Africa. Will Huawei's attempts be rejected by the United States? In truth, such a notion is still reasonable. First of all, a pact between Huawei and the African Union was signed on June 2, 2019, according to Xinhua news agency, at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. This agreement states that the two parties would improve their cooperation in 5G and other areas. On the afternoon of July 20, 2020, South African mobile data network provider Rain declared that it has collaborated with Huawei to launch the continent's first commercial 5G independent networking network. This indicates that Huawei has been operating in Africa for at least 3 and maybe 4 years. America is currently traveling to Africa to disparage Huawei. It ought to and could also wish to make advantage of Huawei's departure to benefit from its 5G successes in Africa. The US also has the slowest 5G network speed in the world, as I already mentioned. Now, it's not necessarily difficult to malign Huawei in this manner. What good would it do to try to backdoor Huawei? They could wish to utilize Huawei technologies to enhance their competitiveness in the 5G industry and fix the problems. American 5G standing in the market. Therefore, this viewpoint suggests that the United States may not genuinely want to relax and savor the potential. In summary, in my perspective, US 5G is currently traveling to China and Africa to seize market share and even to malign Huawei. What is its purpose? Friends who frequently watch our channel, in my opinion, ought to be aware. However, Huawei's 5G is highly potent on its own, so an attempt by the United States to block it may ultimately fail. Thanks for having your watching in this video. You can add your ideas or suggestions below. Please keep following our channel and like our videos.